Football, by the 1920s, had become a global game. It spread from Britain and boomed in countries with a burgeoning urban culture. But for football to have a truly global star, it needed a global competition. And that tournament arrived in 1924 with the Paris Olympics, which delivered football's first world celebrity, the Uruguayan José Andrade. And by the end of the decade, having already won 2 Olympic golds, Andrade was helping Uruguay win the inaugural World Cup. FIFA had been founded in 1904 by the football federations of Belgium, Denmark, France, the Netherlands, Spain, Sweden and Switzerland, although it was the French who took the lead. Despite scepticism from the British nations, FIFA was organising men's football at the Olympics from 1920. And a year after the competition, which was won by Belgium, it had an evangelical president in Jules Rimet, who was convinced both that professionalism was the only way the game could be open to all members of society, and that international competition was a way to spread a spirit of fraternity among nations. The football tournament of the 1924 Olympics in Paris was the biggest international tournament there'd ever been. The British nations were absent, following a dispute over definitions of amateurism. But for the first time, the competition featured teams not only from Europe, but also from North and South America and Africa. It was wildly popular, generating a third of the total income of the Games. Egypt pulled off a major shock by beating a much-fancied Hungary, but it soon became apparent that the team to watch were Uruguay, and Rimet was delighted to have them. Had he not been, he may have looked a little more closely into just how amateur many of the Uruguayan players actually were. But nobody in Uruguay had given any thought as to how they could fund it. In the end, the president of the AUF, Atilio Narancio, put up his house as collateral for a loan to pay for the voyage across the Atlantic. But Uruguay still travelled in steerage and had to play 9 friendly matches in Spain on their way to Paris to raise funds. And yet they were still by far the best side in France. They were led by the tough fullback and captain José Andrade, who would always wear a homemade knitted white hat, and their most gifted player was probably the skillful inside forward Hector Scarona. But the player who captured the imagination of the French public was the free-ranging centre-half José Andrade. Andrade was a fine passer, noted for la tijera, the scissors, a technique by which he could play the ball while lying on the ground. He was good-looking, elegant and charismatic, and he was also black. Now, there had never been a black footballer at the Olympics before 1924. This was a time when the likes of Pablo Picasso, Guillaume Apollinaire and Igor Stravinsky were drawing inspiration from Africa, and primitive modernism was at its height. Coverage of Andrade in the French press places him firmly in that tradition. Inevitably, Andrade was introduced to the great jazz singer Josephine Baker, who, like Andrade, had been dubbed the Black Pearl. They danced a tango together, and whether their relationship went further is unclear, but Andrade was a notorious womanizer. But Paris was fascinated by Uruguay, as they swept through the competition to claim gold by beating Switzerland in the final before a packed crowd at the Stade de Colombes. One of those in attendance that day was the future Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, on work experience in France at the time, and he pawned his coat so that he could buy a ticket. Uruguay confirmed their status as the best country in the world, at least of those prepared to engage in international competition, by retaining their Olympic title in Amsterdam in 1928, beating Argentina in the final. By then, though, it was becoming increasingly clear that, as football professionalised, as the FIFA secretary Henri Delaunay put it, it no longer fit entirely within the framework of the Olympic status, and a new tournament would be needed. There was of course the familiar jockeying to host the tournament, but Uruguay, recognising how Olympic success had promoted the country abroad, were determined. And it was a pleasing coincidence that 1930, the preferred date, happened to coincide with the centenary of their Declaration of Independence. As Uruguay promised to subsidise travel for all competing nations, they won the vote at the 1929 FIFA Congress. As it turned out, European nations proved reluctant to travel. The British nations still hadn't rejoined FIFA. Germany was still obsessed by amateurism, others simply didn't have the resources or the will, and France and Belgium went following lobbying by Rimet and his Belgian vice president, and Romania did so because King Carol II demanded it. Only Yugoslavia seemed to have travelled with anything approaching enthusiasm, as Japan and Siam withdrew late, and Egypt were held up by a storm in the Mediterranean. So the tournament went ahead with only 13 sides. construction of the imposing Estadio Centenario overran. The penalty spot in one game was marked 16 rather than 12 yards from goal, and some of the refereeing was questionable. But the first World Cup ended with a final between the two best sides, a repeat of the 1928 Olympic final, Uruguay against Argentina. Argentina's robust captain Luis Monti received death threats in the build-up and played poorly, but the bigger problem for Argentina was a recurrence of the thigh injury suffered by their forward Pancho Varallo, sustained with a shot that clipped the angle of the post and bar. Had that gone in, Argentina would have led 3-1. As it was, Uruguay, featuring 4 players who'd also played in both Olympic finals, came back to win 4-2. Uruguay were undisputedly the best side in the world, and the World Cup was now up and running. If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Daniel Taylor, Ollie Kay, Amy Lawrence and James Horncastle. With the latest transfer news and insight on every Premier League football story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football.